Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Professor Devarshi Prasad Nath and I teach Cultural Studies at Tejpur University. Today we are going to look at the third module of the paper Comparative Literature and Culture, which I have coordinated. This module, titled Ideology, Discourse and Identity, has been written by Dr. Arnab Baul from the Department of English, Surya Sen College. In this module, we'll be looking at the concepts of ideology, discourse, and identity. The concepts of ideology and discourse are essential for our understanding of the structures of society, its ways of life, cultural practices, and materiality of existence. The process of formation of the human subject, his or her identity, and a subsequent sharing of a specific cultural space is conditioned by the dominant ideology and discourse as it is operative in a specific historical moment. People make their own conditions of existence, but without always being aware about the agencies and forces that obliquely interfere in producing this specific condition. Our cultural life, our association with groups, use of products, our relationship in macro and micro level, the twists and turns, are part of the material life of society. The notion of ideology and discourse attempt to decipher these conditions of materiality with a scientific approach to construct the idea of culture within a broader frame. In general, the concept of ideology is about ideas held in common by social groups in their everyday lives. Tony Dwaits writes in this regard, I quote, "An ideology is about the ideas held in common by social groups in their everyday lives. It also suggests that these ideas are organized in certain ways. An ideology is the logic of ideas, indicating that the groups who hold various ideologies perceive and understand the world in a relatively consistent manner. It can be described as a common set of collective values and beliefs of a class or a social group. For example, a common stereotype of Bollywood movies is that when a woman falls into distress, attacked by goons, it is a male hero who comes to her rescue. The hero single-handedly, with his superhuman skills, fights and defeats the enemy group while the female protagonist watches the miracle as a bystander. The whole process of construction of such a cinematic narration is motivated by a particular mass ideology where males are projected as protector of the weaker sex. We also find in this patriarchal ideology the promotion of the following ideas. A. In our social order, the male is always powerful and authoritative. B. The female should depend on the male for life, as the latter is a protector. And C. Physical toughness is an essential requirement of masculinity and of manhood. Such film narrative tries to promote that an ideal male is really like this, and it is natural for females to crave his protection. A patriarchal ideology, when circulated in a society, will orient men and women in such a way that one group, that is, in this case, the females, is placed in a dependent relation to the other, that is the male. Cinema as a popular cultural text can be read to understand the patterns of ideology operative in a society. As systems of ideas of social groups and movements, ideologies not only make sense in order to understand the world from the point of view of the group, but also as a basis for the social practices of group members. Racist ideologies, for example, may be at the basis of social discrimination. In Europe, the belief that Europeans are superior to non-Europeans was culturally deeply ingrained in the minds of many Europeans, and that more or less subtly controlled their beliefs about non-European others. Through the complex structures of everyday life and culture in Europe, thus people of African descent as well as other non-Europeans are routinely being perceived and evaluated not only as different but also as deviant, problematic and dangerous. One of the crucial social practices influenced by ideologies are language use and discourse. which in turn also influences how we acquire, learn, or change ideologies. Discourse plays a fundamental role in the daily expression and reproduction of ideologies and in the construction of identities. It argues that participants in a social relation understand the relation in terms of linguistic vehicle that organize their thinking and understanding of reality. It is indicative of specific forms of representations and habit of language use, producing specific field of culturally located meanings. Theory of discourse shows that every individual is foreshadowed by established discourses in which various subjectivities are represented already. For example, those of class, gender, and ethnicity. Our own individuality will be constructed through our inhibiting of such a number of discursive subjectivities. Individuality thus becomes a site in which socially produced and historically established discourses are reproduced and regulated. We must remember that theories of ideology, discourse, and the related notion of identity are not mutually exclusive but are intertwined and interdependent on each other. In essence, to quote Mark and Stoddard, where discourse is mobilized to reinforce systems of social power, it functions as ideology. Discourse is not all ideological, however, ideology is discursive, unquote. In this unit, we will examine the concept of ideology in the Marxist tradition. Starting off with Marx, we will move on to the Italian Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci and the French Marxist philosopher Louis-Pierre Althusser and his appropriation and modification of the concept. Next, we will explore the version of discourse theory as elaborated by the French philosopher Michel Foucault, and then its post-Marxist appropriation. The issue of identity as a single unit and at the same time as a part of a social class or group gets negotiated in our discussion on discourse and ideology with the productions of different moments of rupture. Theorizing ideology, Marxist notion of ideology. The Marxist concept of ideology, based on Marxist theories of class conflict, has always been a key analytical tool in cultural studies. Here, it is described as the process through which the dominant ideas within a given society reflect the interest of a ruling economic class. According to Marx, the system of ideas of the ruling class would be the ideology of a given society. The production and distribution of ideas, which is the monopoly of the capitalist class and by which they dominate the thoughts of subordinate groups, ultimately serves to maintain the prevailing system of class inequalities where the ruling class gets the benefit at the cost of the subordinate class. The implication of this contention that the mode of production conditions the intellectual and social life processes is immense, as it shows that, to quote Marx, it is not the consciousness of man that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness, unquote. The function of ideology would be the continual reproduction of the means of production and thereby to ensure the continuous dominance of the ruling class. Marx suggests that ideology is like false consciousness in that it hides from us our real condition of existence. For example, the suppression of the fact that the products we purchase from the market are in fact the result of the exploitation of labor. To take another example from the field of the culture of mass media, average teleserials with the production of the lives and conflicts of rich households, symbolic presentation of affluent life and living, resolution of deftless conflicts as generated in the story, divert our attention from the real world of inequalities, struggle for survival, and the actual tension of living produced by globalization and capitalism. The subordinate class suffers from a false notion of their individual and social position framed in terms of the prevailing ideology of the ruling class and suffers from a sense of alienation. Ideology thus tampers with the law of nature to artificially create a split between the ruling class and the subordinate class. A classical Marxist approach to the study of culture will demand interpretation of practices, text, rituals, use of goods by acknowledging their placement into a specific historical position and analyzing of historical condition that produces them. In the process of production of goods in a capitalist society, we notice a value transformation which is directly linked with the identity of the subordinate class. In society, the use value of the object produced by human labor is replaced by exchange value. The use value of a cup of tea may be realized when I drink it. By contrast, exchange value refers to the social labor that is required to produce the same object, that is tea, for a capitalist economy, and the object can then be exchanged for another commodity. This movement from the use value to the exchange value of the good takes no account of the human labor. In our example, the tea workers and the toil that goes into the making of the product. Marx holds that commodities that are exchanged in the capitalist economy acquire and are invested with an illusory and magical power which he calls fetish, and are then resituated into the economy of exchange. The identity of the laborer as the producer of the good is lost in the process, masterminded by capitalist ideology. Marx believed that people can overcome the ideology of capitalism by acting towards changing the mode of production and the related economic structure. The Marxian notion of ideology has been critiqued and expanded to adapt to the changes in our societies. We now have categories of ethnicity, gender, and race as new sites of power equations in societies and new formulations of the role of ideology in relation to them. But in the process of re-theorizing Marx's notion of ideology, we can refer to the crucial interventions made by people like Antonio Gramsci and Louis Althusser. Louis Althusser, the French Marxist thinker, argues that it is through the functioning of ideological state apparatuses like religion, the legal system, family, law, etc., that a regime through consent can be reproduced. Ideology, the Gramsci and Althusserian interventions. Along with economic conditions, these apparatuses are equally important in creating a willing workforce. Althusser's most important contribution to the study of ideology is the concept of interpellation, the mechanism through which ideology interpellates and constitutes individuals as subjects, that is, as a combination of subjectivity and subjection. In this context, I'd like to quote Judith Butler. The subordination of the subject takes place through language as the effect of the authoritative voice that hails the individual. A policeman hails a passerby on the street, and the passerby turns and recognizes himself as the one who is being hailed. In the exchange by which that recognition is proffered and accepted, interpellation, the discursive production of the social subject, takes place. Unquote. Like Althusser, the Italian political theorist Gramsci saw power located not only in the repressive institutions like the police and the army, but also in the bourgeois cultural industries such as the arts, the media, and education. His concept of hegemony becomes important here. Hegemony is a cultural and ideological means by which the ruling class maintains its dominance by securing the spontaneous consent of the subordinate groups, including the working class. In this regard, Gramsci distinguishes between coercive control, which is manifest through direct force, and control through consensus, when individuals willingly subscribe to values and norms of the dominant group. Gramsci's theory has direct bearing on cultural studies, as popular culture and mass media are the designated sites of the production of hegemony and its transformation. The concept of hegemony of Gramsci explains why working classes have not become revolutionary forces as predicted by Marx. In comparison to Marx's rather rigid definition of ideology, hegemony is a continuous process. The ruling class continuously works to maintain hegemony, and the working class, instead of engaging in revolution, will work through negotiation and resistance. The shifting concepts of ideology in its various articulations has important bearings in the field of cultural studies. Althusser's theory of ideology frees us from rigid base superstructure model of Marx to acknowledge that cultural forms are as active fields as economic structures in shaping identity and addressing social formulations. Taking the cue from Althusser, critics like Terry Eagleton and Frederick Simpson have argued for relative autonomy in cultural and literary domains and rejects the concept of aesthetic unity to appropriate the more implicit appeal of a text as it is conditioned by the ideological weight of its source materials. Similarly, the Gramscian idea of hegemony gives birth to new approaches to the study of culture and its variant forms like popular culture and youth subculture. It is no more possible to brush aside popular cultural forms as being superficial, but to recognize that their renewed potential is a reality. These sites can become alternative spaces for negotiation and resistance by groups who are placed in opposition to the dominant power bloc. Popular has therefore become the site of struggle between the dominant and subordinate cultures at a given historical period. Discourse study. Foucault's notion of discourse. The concept of discourse has a central role in the theory of Michel Foucault. In simple terms, discourses are large groups of statements, systems of thoughts, regulated by a set of rules which exist independent of a particular speaker. It structures the way we see reality. According to Foucault, I quote, "We can now understand the reason for the equivocal meaning of the term discourse, which I have used and abused in many different senses. In the most general and vaguest way, it denoted a group of verbal performances, and by discourse, then, I meant that which was produced, perhaps all that was produced, by the groups of signs. But I also meant a group of acts of formulation, a series of sentences or propositions. Lastly, and it is this meaning that was finally used, together with the first which served in a provisional capacity, discourse is constituted by a group of sequences of signs insofar as they are statements, that is, insofar as they can be assigned particular modalities of existence. The term discourse can be defined as the group of statements that belong to a single system of formation. Thus, I shall be able to speak of clinical discourse, economic discourse, the discourse of natural history, psychiatric discourse, unquote. We have two related terms in this regard, discursive practices and discursive formulations as analytical tools through which we can analyze the kind of statement associated with specific institutions and their construction of a specific idea of truth. Discursive formations are the products of discourses and their formation of objects, subject positions, and strategies. For example, Edward Said in his book Orientalism shows how the West discursively produced the notions of the Orient, politically, culturally, and ideologically, which ultimately justified the West's domination over the East in terms of notions of superiority. Relations of force and power is involved in each stage of this discursive formation. Our sense of the self, our subjectivity, is constructed through our engagement with a multitude of discourses. Discourse can only be conceptualized in relation to power structure and the disciplinary mechanism of that power. In Foucault's scheme of things, discourse and power play important roles. Particularly, power plays an important role as it fashions subjectivity and defines one's position in the social fabric. Here is a clear segregation of discourses from ideology. While orthodox Marxism limits the use of power to the installation of oppressive false consciousness, Foucault will consider any macro-theoretical description of power as hegemonic, which ultimately delimits the full range of the perspective. Knowledge and power are like two sides of the same coin. Hence, the coinage knowledge/power, and that power, which is embodied in the experience and practice of all human groups, can not only be repressive but also productive. Foucault's alternative notions of power has few unique features, like A. Power is something which circulates or something which functions in the form of a chain. B. Power is employed and exercised through a net-like organization and flows in multiple directions. And C. Individuals in Foucault's views are not the targets of power but also elements of its articulation. Power relations thus form an integral part of society, and there cannot be any society without power relations. Power is inscribed within discourses and discourse, and in comparison to ideology, operates in a fluid and negotiated manner. From the perspective of cultural studies, and also from the perspective of comparative literature, it will be our interest to relate discourse theory to see the emergence of new sets of institutional practices like the prison, the asylum, the school, etc., and along with it, the influence of institutions on the project of subject formation. When we approach a literary and cultural text, we can decipher the patterns of operations of power in the narration as it opens up new frontiers of character analysis and also the analysis of social systems. Discourse spreads its influence everywhere. Any material reality is conditioned and thereby gains new meaning through discourse. Lending an interesting everyday example from Stuart Hall, we can say that a round leather ball which we kick is a physical object. It is a ball, but it only becomes a football within the context of the discursive rule of the game, which is socially constructed. Post-Marxist discourse theory. Laclau and Mouffe are the principal figures offering a post-Marxist model of discourse, a challenging attempt to reconstruct the project of the left. Instead of lamenting the decline of class politics and the accumulating irrelevance of the left, Laclau and Mouffe have sought to re-articulate the conceptual framework within which radical leftist politics could be imagined as a potential alternative to both social democracy and the neoliberal conservative politics. Their theory of discourse depends on the following assumptions: rejection of basic Marxist categories like base, superstructure, false consciousness, etc., which were grounded on essentialist thinking. Secondly, the rejection of the notion of class as the only category of political identity, instead accepting the multiplicity of subject positions. They advocate a network of power and points of resistance beyond the confines of economic class. Thirdly, Laclau and Mouffe have also posited the reformulation of Gramsci's notion of hegemony and the use of Althusserian model of ideology and a rejection of essentialist elements of theories of ideology in general. They insist that the world is constructed in and through discourse that is never complete or self-present. Discourse is constituted not in relation to reality, but in relation to an evolving system of meaning that searches continuously for an anchor to fix itself. In Laclau and Mouffe's words, I quote, "The objective world is structured in a relational sequence which do not necessarily have a finalistic sense, and which in most cases do not actually acquire any meaning at all. It is sufficient that certain regularities establish differential positions for us to be able to speak of a discursive formation." Unquote. The concept of articulation becomes important here. Elements of discourse are always articulated in a specific way which debars the possibility of the emergence of meaning. The practice of articulation as fixation or dislocation of a system of differences cannot consist of purely linguistic phenomena, but must instead pierce the entire material density of the multifarious institutions, rituals, and practices through which a discursive formation is structured. They also have insisted that the discursivity of all objects of knowledge has nothing to do with the search for a real external reality which will act as a point of reference. John Story has argued that we have to differentiate between objectivity, the supposed ability to judge without the importance of the context, and the objective world which exists independent of our experience of it. Thus, objects, according to Story, exist independently of our discursive articulation, but it is only within discourse that they can exist as meaningful objects, as Lucklow and Mouffe explain with an example. An earthquake or a falling of a brick is an event that certainly exists, in the sense that it occurs here and now, independently of my will. But whatever their specificity as objects, it is constructed in terms of natural phenomena or expression of the wrath of God, depends upon the structuring of a discursive field. What is denied is not that such objects exist essentially externally to thought, but the rather different assertion that they could constitute themselves as objects outside any discursive condition of emergence. Unquote. Discourse is based on a lack of access to the reality. Our thinking is governed by this unfixity. It thus encourages us to accept plurality as the only fixed point of our negotiation with reality. In our brief survey of the development of the concepts of ideology and discourse, we have crossed a few theoretical milestones, starting from Marx via Gramsci, Althusser to Foucault, and finally reaching at the ideological terrain of the post-Marxists like Lucklow and Mouffe. If in the Marxian idea of ideology we have a strict sense of closure, where the concept emerges from the collision point of the relation of the governing class over the subordinates, conditioned by the dialectics of materialism, in Lucklow and Mouffe we have come across an all-embracing notion of discourse. However, the changing scenario of global politics, social and cultural development, and a change from production-based economy to service-based economy led to the emergence of multiple trajectories of ideology and discourse analysis. Conclusion. The various notions of ideology and discourse theories present a view of culture which is not stable and homogeneous but creative. In our postmodern age, the acceptance of instability of the social and cultural reality itself, instead of becoming a limiting force in the process of thinking, has become a starting point for a more serious engagement with the world. Discourses appear as interesting structures that influence the agencies within its purview. We can refer here to the example of the 9/11 bombing in New York City. This was an event that was constructed by televisual discourse, that is, through a body of representations, example, film footage, statements by authority figures, photographs, eyewitness accounts, reconstructions, etc., which depicted an important historical event in the early 21st century. This discourse, as an example, shows how a particular discourse prioritizes certain ideas about reality and subjects at the cost of neglecting others. The occurrence of 9/11 is a reality, but its meaning is not one-dimensional but discursively produced. To the Western media and to the rest of the world, the 9/11 was a gruesome incident, an attack on the civilized world, as they called it, but at the same time, Palestine electronic media telecasted the pictures of people celebrating the destruction of the Twin Towers. As a result, 9/11 has become a polyphonic discourse, a site of contestation, ever ready to produce varied meanings as per one's cultural, political, ideological orientations. Taking a cue from Si Tzu, we can say that a discourse incites the following questions. What kind of reality is constructed and through what textual and contextual means? What action is performed and how is this done? Who is the producer of the discourse in question? What purposes are achieved and what consequences follow? How is power imbalance maintained or reinforced, and what power practice, for example, domination, repression, and resistance, is exercised and how? How are relationships formed, maintained, or improved? How are new, better, or more useful realities created? A serious engagement with these questions is the beginning of the discursive process of construction of our subjectivities. With this, we come to the end of the module on ideology, discourse, and identity. Thank you.